The airport was alive with its usual chaos that morning, rolling suitcases bumping along the floor, announcements echoing from overhead speakers, and the subtle tension of passengers rushing to their destinations. Among the sea of travelers, a young black boy named Ethan Johnson, only 13 years old, stood out, not because of what he wore, but because of how he carried himself. He held his boarding pass tightly, his eyes scanning the gate number with focus. His father, Marcus Johnson, couldn't accompany him on this trip because of urgent business overseas, but he had insisted his son travel in first class for comfort and safety. Ethan wasn't like most boys his age, where others might have played video games or distracted themselves with endless chatter. Ethan had a quiet strength about him, a maturity that reflected his upbringing. His father always reminded him, "Son, money may put you in first class, but character is what keeps you respected no matter where you sit." As the boarding announcement rang out, "First-class passengers may now board," Ethan walked confidently to the front of the line. His heart raced with anticipation. Flying was always an adventure for him, but when he stepped into the luxurious first-class cabin, his excitement quickly dimmed. There, in seat 2A, his assigned seat, sat a middle-aged white woman in a pristine cream-colored suit. Her expensive handbag rested on the armrest, and she scrolled through her phone as if the world revolved around her. Ethan paused, double-checked his ticket, and approached politely. "Excuse me, ma'am. I think this might be my seat. I'm—" The woman lifted her eyes slowly, her gaze dripping with disdain. She scanned him from head to toe, his modest clothes, his youth, his skin. Then, with a scoff, she said, "That's impossible. This is my seat. Check again, child. You must be confused. Economy is back there." Her words stung, but Ethan kept his composure. He glanced at his ticket again. "I'm sure, ma'am. It says 2A, first class." The woman let out a mocking laugh. "First class? For you? Oh, please. Do you expect me to believe a boy like you is sitting up here? Maybe they made a mistake on your ticket. You people always try to sneak into places you don't belong." Those last words made several nearby passengers shift uncomfortably. A businessman across the aisle raised his eyebrows, and a young couple whispered to each other. Phones began to discreetly rise, recording the interaction. Ethan took a breath, remembering his father's voice. Never let anger be your first response. Respect yourself, and let your actions speak louder than their prejudice. So he said calmly, "Ma'am, I believe there's been no mistake, but if you'd like, we can ask the flight attendant to check." Her lips curled into a smirk. "Fine, let's do that. Let's prove once and for all who belongs here." The flight attendant, a woman in her 30s with a practiced professional smile, approached. "Is everything okay here?" "Yes," Ethan said politely, handing over his boarding pass. "I think there's some confusion about my seat," the woman interrupted, her voice sharp. "There's no confusion. This boy is trying to claim my seat. Look at him. He doesn't belong in first class. Surely you can see that?" The flight attendant frowned and scanned Ethan's ticket. After a moment, she looked up firmly. "Ma'am, this seat does in fact belong to him. Passenger 2A is reserved for Mr. Ethan Johnson." The woman blinked, her face flushing. "What? That's ridiculous. How could—" "Ma'am," the attendant cut in gently but with authority, "you'll need to take your assigned seat. I'll help you find it." The woman's voice rose. "No, I won't sit next to him either. This is absurd. I paid good money for my comfort, and now I'm being told I have to give up my seat to a child like this?" Passengers shifted, some shaking their heads in disgust. A man muttered, "Unbelievable." Another whispered to his partner, "Poor kid." Ethan remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor for a moment. Then, as the tension escalated, he lifted his head and said softly, "It's okay. I don't want to cause trouble." The attendant hesitated. "Sir, you're entitled to your seat." But Ethan interrupted. "It's fine. I'll take another one." The woman smirked triumphantly as the attendant reseated Ethan across the aisle. "That's better," she said loudly. "Finally, some order." But order was the last thing that would come. Because what the woman and the rest of the passengers didn't know was that this polite boy wasn't just any passenger. He was the son of the man who owned the airline. And soon, the truth would unravel in a way that would leave everyone, especially her, speechless. The engines roared to life as the plane began taxiing down the runway. The soft hum of anticipation filled the cabin, but in first class, tension lingered like a storm cloud. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier confrontation exchanged knowing glances. Some shook their heads in disbelief at the white woman's arrogance, while others looked curiously at the young black boy who had handled the situation with such quiet dignity. Ethan sat across the aisle now, his back straight, his small leather journal resting on his lap. He opened it slowly and began to write. His father had given him the journal as a gift, urging him to record his thoughts, dreams, and lessons from life's experiences. The passenger behind him, a woman in her late 20s traveling on business, leaned slightly forward, curious. She caught a glimpse of his words. "When people judge you, don't fight to prove them wrong with anger. Prove them wrong by being exactly who you are meant to be. Dad says respect is the most powerful weapon, and today, I'm holding it tight." Free. Woman's eyes softened. She thought to herself, "This boy is wiser than most adults I know." Across the aisle, however, the white woman sat with her chin lifted proudly, ordering a glass of champagne as if nothing had happened. Yet, beneath her confidence, there was a flicker of unease. She had expected the boy to throw a tantrum, to lash out, to prove her stereotypes right. Instead, his calmness unsettled her. It was as though she had tried to break him, and he had, only grown taller. As the plane climbed into the sky, turbulence struck briefly, shaking the cabin. Gasps rippled through first class. The woman clutched her armrests tightly, her champagne glass rattling dangerously. "Oh my God, is this plane safe?" she cried, her voice cracking. Ethan, however, remained calm. He closed his journal, whispered a quiet prayer under his breath, and looked out the window at the clouds. His serenity stood in sharp contrast to her panic. A nearby passenger noticed and whispered to his wife, "That boy is something else. Look how steady he is." The flight attendant, passing by, leaned down to Ethan. "You're handling this really well. Not many adults could stay that calm." Ethan smiled faintly. "My father always says storms don't last forever. You just have to trust the pilot." The woman rolled her eyes at his words, muttering, "Please, he's just a child. What does he know about storms?" But even as she dismissed him, something about the boy's poise gnawed at her. Minutes passed, and the turbulence eased. The cabin settled into quiet, but whispers began to circulate again. Some passengers whispered about the woman's behavior earlier. Others whispered about Ethan. One man in a tailored suit leaned toward his colleague and said, "I wonder who his parents are. He's not ordinary." The colleague nodded. "He carries himself differently. You can tell he comes from strong roots." Ethan didn't hear them, but he felt the weight of eyes watching him. He wasn't used to attention, and he didn't want it. His father always reminded him that humility was more important than recognition. Still, he couldn't help but think about what his dad would say if he had seen the incident earlier. He reached for his phone, checked the time, and saw a message waiting from his father. "Proud of you, son. Remember, your actions today will teach the world more than 1,000 words. I'll meet you at the terminal." Ethan smiled. His father always knew the right thing to say at the right time. But one part of the message caught his eye. The line about the crew being notified. Ethan knew what that meant. His father had made arrangements, not just for his comfort, but to ensure the flight crew knew who they were serving. And yet, Ethan didn't want special treatment. He wanted to be treated like any other passenger, because respect should not depend on wealth, power, or connections. Across the aisle, the woman finally broke the silence. She leaned slightly toward Ethan, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "So, young man, tell me, how exactly did you end up in first class? Did someone feel sorry for you? Or did your parents win the lottery?" A ripple of discomfort spread through the nearby passengers. A man in the row behind muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable. She just won't stop." Ethan turned slowly, meeting her eyes. His voice was calm but carried weight. "My father worked very hard for me to be here. He taught me that where you sit on a plane doesn't define who you are, but how you treat people does." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The woman froze, her smirk faltering. For a brief moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, shame. But pride quickly masked it again. "Well," she said stiffly, "I suppose we'll see if those lessons take you anywhere in life." Ethan didn't reply. Instead, he opened his journal again and wrote quietly, "Sometimes silence is the loudest answer. Sometimes you don't argue with arrogance. You let it hear its own echo." A man seated diagonally across from him watched, shaking his head in awe. He pulled out his phone and began typing, posting about the incident online. Within minutes, a story titled, "Young Boy Humiliated in First Class Responds with Grace" began spreading on social media. The woman had no idea her every word was being documented, nor did she know the truth about the boy sitting across from her, a truth that would soon crash through her pride like a tidal wave, because Ethan wasn't just another boy with a first-class ticket. He was the heir to the very airline she was sitting on, and the moment the captain's voice came over the intercom, her world would tilt upside down. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane leveled off thousands of feet above the clouds. The faint clinking of glasses and the rustle of newspapers filled the silence. Most passengers had begun to settle into their long flight, but in first class, tension was far from over. Ethan sat quietly in his seat, his pen gliding across the pages of his journal. Every so often he paused, staring out the window at the endless sky. His father always told him that flying was a reminder of possibility, proof that even the heaviest things could rise if they were built the right way. Across the aisle, the white woman sat stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line. She sipped her champagne with exaggerated grace, as though trying to prove something to everyone watching. Yet her mind wasn't at ease. The boy's composure had rattled her. It was one thing to dismiss him as a child out of place, but his words about respect, about dignity, had echoed in her mind longer than she cared to admit. Passengers continued to whisper. Some glanced at Ethan with quiet admiration. Others glared at the woman, their disapproval clear, but no one confronted her outright. Instead, they waited, sensing something bigger was unfolding. Then it happened. Ethan's phone buzzed softly. He reached into his pocket and unlocked the screen. A message from his father appeared. "Everything okay? I heard from the crew. Remember who you are. I'll meet you when you land. Proud of you always." Ethan smiled. Just reading those words steadied him. His father, Marcus Johnson, was a man who had built an empire from nothing. Years ago, Marcus was a poor mechanic fixing broken-down cars in a neighborhood where dreams rarely took flight. But he worked tirelessly, saved every penny, and eventually pursued his vision of starting an airline that treated people with dignity, not just as passengers, but as human beings. That airline, Johnson Airways, was now one of the most respected carriers in the world, and Ethan was his only son, the heir to a legacy worth billions. But Ethan didn't flaunt that truth. His father had raised him to live by values, not status. That's why, when the woman mocked him earlier, he hadn't shouted back. He knew his worth wasn't tied to proving himself to her. Still, her arrogance had cut deeper than she realized. "The woman? noticing his smile as he read the message, leaned across the aisle and scoffed. "What's so amusing? Did your mother text you from the back of the plane? Or maybe your babysitter?" A few passengers gasped at her cruelty. A man in a navy suit muttered, "This is beyond ridiculous." Another whispered, "She doesn't realize who she's talking to." Ethan didn't rise to her bait. He simply replied, "It was my father." "Oh, really?" she said, sarcasm dripping. "And what does he do? Sell peanuts in the economy cabin?" The words were sharp, meant to wound. But before Ethan could answer, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's calm voice echoed through the cabin, "we'd like to take a moment to recognize a very special passenger on today's flight. Johnson Airways is what it is today because of one man's vision, and we are honored to have his son flying with us today in first class. Please join me in welcoming Master Ethan Johnson, son of our founder and CEO, Mr. Marcus Johnson." The cabin erupted in a wave of stunned silence. Eyes widened, mouths dropped. Passengers turned toward Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, not used to the attention. But across the aisle, the woman's face turned pale. Her champagne glass trembled in her hand. "Johnson?" she whispered. "As in Johnson Airways?" Ethan nodded softly. "Yes, my father built this airline." Gasps echoed around the cabin. A woman 2 rows back whispered to her husband, "That's him. That's the boy." Phones quickly lit up, recording reactions, snapping photos. Within minutes, posts would flood social media. "Woman refuses seat to airline owner's son." The white woman's smugness evaporated. Her arrogance melted into visible fear. Her words from earlier, "Kids like you don't belong here," now replayed in her mind. Burning with shame, she realized she had humiliated not just a boy, but the son of the very man who controlled the seat she was sitting in. Passengers began murmuring in defense of Ethan. One man clapped softly, soon joined by others. Applause rippled through first class. The woman, shrinking in her seat, looked as though the ground had disappeared beneath her. Ethan, however, didn't gloat. He didn't point fingers or throw her words back at her. Instead, he looked at her calmly and said, "You didn't need to know who I was. You just needed to treat me like a person." The words pierced deeper than any scolding could have. The woman's eyes filled with tears, her pride collapsing. For the first time in years, she felt truly small, not because of money, not because of power, but because of her own choices. The passengers who had doubted him now admired him. Those who had stayed silent earlier felt inspired. Ethan had turned humiliation into a lesson, not just for the woman but for everyone watching, but this was only the beginning. The real test would come when the plane landed, and Ethan's father, Marcus Johnson himself, stepped forward to confront the woman face to face. And when that moment arrived, no one in that airport would ever forget it. The air inside the cabin felt different after the captain's announcement. What had been silent judgment and whispered conversations earlier had now shifted into an atmosphere of stunned respect. Passengers leaned forward, whispering in awe, some even sneaking photos of Ethan, the quiet boy who had been insulted only an hour earlier. But across the aisle, the once proud woman sat frozen. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. She tried to lift, her champagne glass to her lips, but her hand trembled too much. The bubbles fizzed angrily as if mocking her discomfort. For the first time, she wasn't worried about how she looked to others. She was terrified of what she had revealed about herself. All those smug words, all those arrogant assumptions, now replayed in her head like a cruel echo. "Do you really expect me to believe a boy like you can afford first class? Kids like that don't fly here. Your parents must have won the lottery." She closed her eyes, wishing she could erase the past hour, but she couldn't. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had heard it. And worse, everyone had seen how the boy had handled it better than she ever could. Ethan, meanwhile, wasn't reveling in her discomfort. He wasn't smirking or gloating. He sat quietly, his journal once again open, his pen moving across the page. But this time, instead of private notes, he wrote something with deliberate care. Finally, he tore the page out, folded it neatly, and stood. The cabin grew still as he walked across the aisle and handed the folded paper to the woman. Confused, she took it and slowly opened it. Her eyes scanned the words, and her throat tightened. On the paper, in Ethan's neat handwriting, it read, "Respect should never depend on who someone is, but simply on the fact that they are a person. My father always says, true class is not in the seat you buy, but in the way you treat others. I hope you remember this next time." The woman's eyes blurred with tears. Her lip trembled. For years, she had hidden behind her wealth, her designer clothes, her perfect smile at social gatherings. But here was a child, a boy younger than her nephew, teaching her a lesson she had never truly learned. She whispered, struggling to form words. "I don't know what to say." Ethan looked at her gently. "You don't have to say anything to me, but you might want to say something to yourself." The cabin was silent, everyone listening. The woman's pride cracked, her facade shattering in front of strangers. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't try to wipe them away. I've been wrong," she admitted softly, her voice breaking. "All my life, I've judged people by what they wear, how they look, where they sit. I thought it made me better, but it only made me smaller." Her confession stunned the passengers. The same woman who had demanded special treatment earlier was now exposed, raw, vulnerable. One passenger, an elderly man in a fedora, spoke up gently. "It's never too late to change, ma'am. But it starts with humility." The woman nodded, her tears falling freely. She turned back to Ethan, her voice shaking. I'm sorry. Truly sorry. I judged you without even knowing you, and I humiliated myself more than I humiliated you." Ethan gave a small smile. "My father always tells me that mistakes are teachers. What matters is if we listen to the lesson." The cabin grew quiet again. But this time it wasn't a silence of judgment, it was a silence of reflection. People weren't just watching a boy and a woman, they were watching a mirror of their own lives. How many times had they made assumptions about others? How many times had they measured someone's worth by money, appearance, or status? The woman, still crying softly, whispered, "You're only 13. How do you know so much already?" Ethan glanced out the window, his voice calm but full of wisdom. "Because my father lived without respect for a long time. He was poor. People ignored him, laughed at him, treated him like he didn't matter. And he promised himself that if he ever made it, he would teach me that money can buy comfort, but it can't buy character. He said character is built every time you choose kindness, when it's easier to choose arrogance." The words struck not just the woman, but every passenger listening. Some lowered their heads, ashamed of their own past judgments. Others blinked back tears. The woman finally nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the note as if it were a lifeline. "I don't deserve your kindness, but you gave it to me anyway. I will not forget this." Ethan returned to his seat quietly, leaving the cabin in thoughtful silence. The woman sat with the note in her hands, staring at it over and over again, as though it were written on her heart. The rest of the flight passed without arrogance, without whispers of judgment. People were kinder to one another. Passengers smiled more, and for the first time in years, the woman felt lighter. Not because of wealth, not because of comfort, but because she had faced the truth about herself. But the lesson was not over, because when the plane landed and the doors opened, the woman would come face to face with the man who had raised Ethan, the airline's billionaire owner. And his words would either deepen her shame or give her a chance at redemption. The plane descended smoothly, its wheels touching the runway with a soft thud. The cabin erupted in the usual rustle of unbuckling seatbelts and the shuffle of passengers gathering their belongings. But this landing was different. Everyone in first class knew they were about to witness something unforgettable. The whispers had grown louder throughout the flight. Phones had captured the woman's arrogance, Ethan's quiet dignity, and the stunning reveal of his identity. And now everyone wondered, what would happen when the boy's father arrived? Ethan sat calmly, buckling his journal back into his backpack. He didn't seem nervous at all. His father had always taught him that the truest measure of a man or a boy wasn't in how others treated him, but in how he treated others, even when wronged. Across the aisle, the woman sat stiff and pale, the folded note from Ethan clutched tightly in her hand. She hadn't let go of it once since he gave it to her. She replayed every arrogant word she had spoken, every dismissive look, and every assumption she had made. Her stomach twisted with shame. What would his father say to her? Would he humiliate her the way she had humiliated his son? Would he demand she be removed from the airline? The answer waited just outside the jet bridge. As the doors opened, a crowd of airport staff stood in neat formation. Cameras flashed. Journalists had already gathered, tipped off by social media posts that had gone viral mid-flight. At the center of it all stood Marcus Johnson, tall, dignified, with an aura that commanded respect without a single word. His tailored suit was sharp, but it was his calm, steady presence that drew every eye. Ethan stepped off the plane, and the crowd erupted in applause. Marcus knelt slightly, pulling his son into a tight embrace. "I heard what happened," he whispered. "And I am proud of you, son. You carried my legacy better than I ever could." Passengers exiting behind Ethan paused to watch the reunion. Some wiped their eyes, others clapped softly. Even hardened business travelers looked moved by the sight of a billionaire embracing his son not with pride in wealth, but with pride in character. Then came the woman. She walked slowly, her once proud stride reduced to timid steps. Her eyes were downcast, her hands shaking as she still clutched Ethan's handwritten note. For the first time in her life, she felt like a child, about to face judgment. Marcus noticed her immediately. His eyes, sharp yet calm, settled on her. She froze, unable to move. The crowd around them seemed to vanish. Finally, gathering what little courage she had left, she stepped forward. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Mr. Johnson, I owe you and your son an apology. I treated him terribly. I judged him before I even knew him. And when I realized who he was, I felt ashamed not because of his name, but because of what I saw in myself. I was wrong, completely wrong." The crowd hushed, waiting for Marcus's response. Would he rebuke her publicly? Would he unleash his anger? But Marcus simply placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and spoke in a calm, firm voice. "You don't owe me an apology. You owe it to him." The woman turned toward Ethan, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I am so sorry, Ethan. Not because of who your father is, but because I failed to see who you are. You showed me more dignity than I deserved. You taught me something I should have known long ago. That respect is not about money, race, or age. It's about humanity." Ethan nodded, his voice gentle but steady. "I forgive you. But remember, kindness should never depend on knowing someone's last name. Treat everyone with respect, because you never know the story they carry." The woman broke down, sobbing openly. She clutched the note against her chest as though it were scripture. In that moment, she wasn't a wealthy traveler or a proud socialite. She was simply human, humbled and changed by the wisdom of a boy. The crowd around them clapped softly. Some recorded the moment. Others bowed their heads, deeply moved. Marcus looked at his son with pride shining in his eyes. "You see, Ethan, this is why I built this airline. Not just to fly people across the world, but to remind them that no matter where they sit, first class, economy, or anywhere in life, we are all passengers on the same journey. And on that journey, respect is the only ticket that matters." The words rippled through the crowd. Strangers nodded. Some wiped tears. A story that had begun with arrogance and humiliation had turned into a lesson the entire world needed to hear. Later that day, the video went viral. News channels picked it up. Headlines read, "Billionaire's son teaches arrogant passenger a lesson in respect. Young boy's wisdom goes viral. Respect is priceless." But for Ethan, the fame didn't matter. He wasn't interested in headlines or likes. All he cared about was his father's proud smile, the note still clutched in the woman's hand, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, his small act of dignity had planted a seed of change. And as he walked out of the airport hand in hand with his father, Ethan knew one thing for sure. He didn't just inherit his father's airline. He was carrying forward his father's greatest legacy, the power of humility, the strength of character, and the truth that respect costs nothing, but means everything. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories. Remember, true class isn't about where you sit, but how you treat others.